Hi, today we're going to talk about the repository pattern. I've seen a lot of discussion about that on LinkedIn, for example. And I don't know why the hell people think the repository pattern is only a proxy from the application layer to some ARM or some persistence library from your favorite framework. I don't know why. I hear a lot in my inner circle that the repository pattern it's a proxy to Eloquent, for example, which is a ARM from Laravel framework. I have to say that's totally not true. And today we're going to understand why. So a quick theory about the repository pattern. First, what it isn't. It isn't a proxy. If you have been doing this and you are calling this the repository pattern, I have to say, you're wrong. I used to think that as well. It's okay, all right? But that is what most tutorials call the repository pattern, and it's not. What is happening here? We have three methods, all find and create. The parameter for the second one defined is the ID of the incremental table, and this is the first thing you should check. What you see in the parameters, the method signature is important, right? And we are using in this side the user model from Eloquent, right? We can see the namespace here and we can see the imports as well. But what I meant here is that this is the model from Eloquent. That's why you have static methods calling all, find, create that are totally Laravel Eloquent. All right, and this is a proxy. Yes, this is a proxy. But why the hell you call that user repository? That is not a repository at all. So according to Eric Evans from the Blue Book, the author of the Domain-Driven Design book, a repository is a mechanism for encapsulating storage, retrieval, and search behavior, okay, which emulates a collection of objects. So key phrase, collection of objects, not, as I said here, not database table. The repository, the goal is basically to provide you an interface to access and to persist aggregates. That's the keyword. Aggregates from where? What is an aggregate? Aggregates, they are a set of domain objects that make sense to live together as a unified concept. That's what an aggregate is. It's usually formed by entities, value objects, and more, right? That's what you see usually. And an aggregate can have a lot of relationships with the database. It's not the goal of the domain model to decide that. That's the goal of the repository. The bridge between the domain model formed by value objects, by entities, by aggregates, and between the database, the bridge is the repository pattern. That's why the repository provides an interface to access and persist aggregates. What do you need to retrieve and to build up the customer aggregate in memory? So inside this customer, we can have a lot of objects that make sense to live together with the customer. And we are loading in memory. That's the goal of the repository. And if the state of the customer changes, then we can persist the new state using the reverse way, the save method, and this time passing the aggregate, the whole object, as reference. The repository know how to deal with this domain object. That's the goal of the repository. Domain doesn't care about the persistence layer. So the bridge between the domain model and the persistence layer is the repository. And that's not a repository. repository is not a prox. As I said before, this is access. This is trying to access Eloquent directly, and we are retrieving Eloquent collection. And in the find method, we are retrieving the user model. They create the same thing. It's not, if this is the implementation, if we are inside the infrastructure layer where we can deal with the implementation of the repository, it is okay to use Eloquent if this is a strategy to deal with Eloquent. It's okay. The problem is the method signature. It's the API you are trying to API. You are trying to create to access your persistence layer. If the signature is saying pure types and the return type is user model, you are exposing the technology you use, and that's not how the repository works. So you are basically doing this controller that access the repository, which is not a repository, it's a prox, and this is trying to retrieve the Eloquent model, and the Eloquent model that use the pattern of the active record is the one to deal with the database. And as I said, you are retrieving an Eloquent model, and you are still coupled with Eloquent. That's not a goal here. So the key insight, you need to return aggregates. For repositories to work properly, you need to work with aggregates, not Eloquent models. And that means plain PGP classes representing your domain, no extends model, no database concerns in the aggregate. It's a pure object, agnostic to any technology or framework. And as I said, the repository is the bridge between the domain model and the persistence layer. In my personal blog, I wrote an article called Implementing the Repository Pattern the Right Way. And here I explained a little bit deeper about the concept, what is a domain model, what is an entity, and what else? What are value objects? What are aggregates? According to Eric Evans, for instance, an aggregate is a cluster of domain objects that we treat as a unit for the purpose of data chains, right? So the aggregate defines the consistence boundary. Groups, entities, value objects, they need to be modified together because they work as a unit. We are managing state here. So this group has a state that makes sense to change these states together. They work as a unit. So how so, Lucas? Can you give an example? Yes, in the article we have an example. And this is a very common example, a very famous example, the e-commerce example. So we have order and order items. We don't deal with ordering items together because the order, the aggregate hood, which is an entity, we can see right away because we have the identification of the entity here represented by order ID. This guy, the aggregate hood, is the one to orchestrate all these other domain objects, the value objects. Customer ID, it's a value object. Order ID is the identification. Those are properties that belongs to the order. And items, they are entities. Order item is an entity. So a secondary entity. The main entity, the aggregate hoods, and the secondary entities managed by order. So that's what this part is trying to explain. The main entity through which all external access must pass. So the aggregate defines the consistence boundary. So yeah, I'm gonna leave this article in the comments in the description of the video, and you can check for yourself. So the main goal of the article is to explain a little bit deeper the concepts of the domain model, how the repository makes the bridge between the domain model and the persistence layer. And yeah, that's it. I'm gonna leave in the description. Okay, so now let's put some theory into practice. I have a project here. It's called GuestHub. It's hotel management, basically, and the goal here is to be able to deal with guests, authentication, and a few more stuff. First, let me introduce the project structure here. I'm using Laravel 12, using PHP 4 8.4, not 4, 8.4. And for the API, I'm using Bruno API, right? And Docker as well. So there is a README here you can check. It's everything very well explained. So yeah. And here right away you can see that I've made some changes on the default structure of Laravel. I don't have the app folder. I'm working with the modules folder instead. And everything's related to Laravel. They live inside each bounded context. So yeah, in order to organize this into a modular monolith, I've wrote some bounded contexts, and inside each bounded context, I have my own structure following what you already know, the application layer, the domain layer, and the infrastructure layer. That's, I think by now you are very aware about those folders, and the folders, they are not the main thing to define the architecture, right? The design, but they help a lot to organize your thoughts. By organizing into folders, you can check right away. I'm dealing with bounded context here. And the main bounded context is the reservation one. So Lucas, where Laravel stuff lives inside infrastructure. If you want to check Eloquent, for example, infrastructure, persistence, Eloquent. That's where things should live. Migrations as well. Seeders as well. Okay, inside persistence, infrastructure is the right place to deal with framework and drivers. Remember, clean architecture, frameworks, and driver. The most external layer where you deal with hardware, low level. The most external in clean architecture, more close to the hardware. The more internal, more close to the domain. That's what we are doing here. And here inside domain, I have my entities, and the reservation here is the aggregate hooks. Okay. And inside the entity folder is we have secondary entities, right? So I'm gonna open here inside my infrastructure so you can have a better visualization. I'm gonna open up the routes file, and each bounded context has its own routes file, right? And inside reservation, let's start like this. I'm not going to start from the internal layer to the external layer. Let's start from the external one, more close to the hardware, the HTTP stuff, and then we are going to go inside each layer together, okay? So let's start with the API. I'm gonna close the README, the composer JSON. Let's start here. So for example, what if I want to create a reservation for this hotel? I can go to the controller, and if you check down here, I'm inside modules, reservation, infrastructure, HTTP controllers. Okay, that's how you can navigate throughout the structure. And inside the controller, you can see right away that I have handlers. And each handler belongs to the application layer. They are like, if you study a little bit about ports and adapters, you will see that each port is your way into the domain. So where I am right now, that's the first question. I am inside the infrastructure layer, dealing with controllers and HTTP stuff, right? That's why I have JSON response here. A good way to locate yourself is checking the imports. So do you see we are dealing with Illuminate? That's a red flag to say, hey, you are inside the infrastructure layer because you are using third-party libraries. It's where you do that usually. I'm not talking about exceptions, edge case where we don't respect these rules. But usually, if you are inside a clean architecture structure, if you see third-party usage, library usage, it's the infrastructure layer, right? So that's why the controller lives here. Some folks like to put the controller inside the presentation layer and create some interfaces to deal with the requests, objects, and so on and so forth, right? But in my case here, I'm dealing directly with Eloquent, right? So it's only an explanation, only to for you who is asking about those guys. That's why I decided to put the controllers inside the infrastructure layer, right? So I can have in my signature objects that belongs to external packets. In this case, Illuminate. Okay, let's move on. And so handlers, they are the ports. Inside my handlers, I'm respecting totally the clean architecture, right? So let's go inside this handler. The create reservation handler. Well, let's check the imports. Everybody belongs to domain and application. Perfect. Because application, they are the same layer where I am right now. If I check reservation, application, right here, down here, right? The commands, the ports, they are the way into the domain. They are my application services. It's the place where I can manage the domain objects. I'm gonna record a video about that in the future, in the near future, but let's focus on the repository pattern. All you have to know that this is the place where I finally will handle and deal with repository, because the application service represented by my command handler here, they are the place to orchestrate domain objects. And the usual way we do that is by using repository. So if you check here, I have some steps before I reach the repository pattern, the repository pattern part. But here we are. And if you check, it's always using dependency inversion, because this is about what I explained. This is about what I said earlier about being able to switch technology. If you want to be able to decouple things, usually you work with dependency inversion, right? With contracts. And then you can implement separately the implementation of the interface. Okay, you can work separately. And how we do that? What is this reservation? As I said, the reservation is the aggregates. You see? And this belongs to domain. And the contract of the repository is saying what? Hey, to save the reservation, you gotta use a domain aggregates. So the contract is very explicit. What about the output? Void. Okay. If you check the other methods, I'm retrieving the aggregate as well. What about this other one? Find by guest profile ID. I'm returning array. Fair enough. And the pagination. In this case, we have an endpoint that uses pagination. In this case, we are using a DTO, okay? Never, 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 never we can have here external stuff. Never. Because this is agnostic. This lives inside the most internal layer, the domain layer, okay? So what is the paginated results? It's a DTO and lives inside shared domain because all the bounded contexts are able to use these objects as well in their repositories, okay? So now you can see how it works, and then you can write implementations to this interface. And where the implementation lives, the infrastructure layer. So if I follow the implementation, I will find what? The query builder reservation repository. And this guy is living inside persistence layer infrastructure of the reservation bounded context, okay? My module, which module? The reservation one. And if in the future I wanna deal with a different technology, a different approach, I can write another implementation who will implement the reservation repository contract as well. That's how the repository pattern works. So keep in mind the signature, the objects should be domain objects, and you always have to deal with dependency inversion, okay? Those are the traits of a true repository. And in some case, if you are dealing with a situation where you have one aggregate that is mapped to a single table for CRUD operation, create, read, update, delete operations, in that case, it's useful to have a base repository. And I have a base repository to this kind of situation. Here, the base repository inside the infrastructure layer is the one responsible to deal with those situations where I have one-on-one relationships, one aggregate to one table. Because it's not always that I will have a complex aggregate. Sometimes I will have to deal with CRUD operations. And is in this kind of situation that people usually complain about domain-driven design because they think it's too much, a lot of classes, a lot of files, only to make simple operations, right? But this is a trade-off. In order to have a better logic, a better organization, a better flow for the company, for the complex case, we have to apply the rules and the architecture to the simple cases as well. It's a trade-off. That's why you have to be very aware about those trade-offs before you jump in a design like that using domain-driven design or any other architecture. You have to understand the trade-offs and then make the decisions and accept the bad part of your choice, okay? So yeah, base repository is covered as well. I'm gonna leave this GitHub repository available in the comments as well. And I'm gonna stop the video here. So guys, leave it a like, subscribe. Thank you.